This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources. Consistent with its running right process, Alpha is an energy company committed to being a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward. We fuel progress around the world. More information at alphanr.com.
The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond. We're delighted to have the Lieutenant Governor back with us again, but this time we're talking about the Commonwealth Council on Childhood Success that you chair. Executive order of the governor created the council. You've been meeting for some time now, and just earlier this summer in June submitted your 16 recommendations. And they're members of that council who represent lots of different areas. And with you today, see if I get the name right, Tony Kakashi Bashir, who works in Hampton Roads, in Southampton Roads, and the CEO of Children's Harbor, and has been involved in early childhood education for a great deal. One of the members of the council, along with you, the Lieutenant Governor, chairing it. And we're interested in your helping our viewers get a glimpse in this time that we have together about the issues that you're working on. We may not cover every one of the 16 recommendations, but we'll put up on the screen where they can go on the web and read those and study them and react to them. But what are some of the top ones that you're working on?
Well, David, thank you for having Tony and me on here today. And we're very excited about early childhood development, and I do encourage the viewers to go on and look at the work that we've been doing here in the Commonwealth, and hopefully how this will contribute to economic development in Virginia. And you know, when the governor and I and Mark Herring ran for office in 2013, that was one of our goals, was to promote economic development. And you know, one of the ways to do that is to emphasize education, workforce development. And you know, my background, Tony's background, is in early childhood development, and you know, there's a lot of people, and really in a bipartisan manner, that are very enthusiastic about our children's future and their education in particular. So the governor, Terry McAuliffe, and his wife, who also is very enthusiastic, especially in the area of nutrition, formed the Children's Cabinet. And the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Health, the Secretary of Commerce, I sit on that. And then within the Children's Cabinet, we have the Commonwealth Council for Childhood Success, and I chair that. And we have, I guess, about 30, Tony, individuals from diverse backgrounds across the Commonwealth. And so we have been working very hard and have come up with the 16 recommendations that we propose to the governor. But the areas that we're really concentrating on, first of all, is increasing or spreading access to pre-K education. And to start that process, one of the things that we did is we applied for a grant, a federal grant, and we were awarded that grant, and it's a total of $70 million over 4 years. So we're very excited about that to help jumpstart that process. But we know that our children, even before they get to kindergarten, have a tremendous learning potential, not only for the didactics, but also to learn about good nutrition and staying away from cigarettes and drugs. So a lot of emphasis is going into pre-K education. The second area is our child care, and we sometimes don't think about that, but most of our parents in the Commonwealth are working parents, and so we need to make sure that there's accessible, affordable, and quality child care across the Commonwealth. So we're working on that. And then finally, we want to make sure that our children are healthy and ready to go to school, that their nutrition is good, that they have access to a primary care provider, that their immunizations are up to date. So those are the areas that we're working on, and the 16 recommendations that your viewers can look at really cover those 3 areas.
Tony, as I understand, you've been in Southampton Roads for almost 30 years working.
Yes.
And from your experience and being the CEO and director of 4 different facilities there, tell us your perspectives on these issues that the Lieutenant Governor's started.
Well, and my primary, it would be the quality and the access piece, working with multiple families. My agency's been in existence for 104 years, so we've been doing this a day or two. And so, the issues that I see and have seen over the 30 years continue, having some voice to what we do, but the quality piece, defining what quality is and making sure the parents have, our mission in our agency is that every child has access to quality, and so defining what is quality, and it, that comes in terms of teacher education, it comes in terms of environments and what the children are exposed to, and then the access piece is, can they afford it? An infant in our state typically costs more than college tuition. So the yearly fee for an infant, the weekly fee for an infant, as you add it up for a year, is more than college education. And these are families who are struggling, in their beginnings of their lives, because when you have an infant, you're usually a whole lot younger, and so that you're not necessarily have climbed a corporate ladder or are stable in a job. So in order for them to go to work and support their families, then the access piece is really critical.
Say a bit more on that, because you really caught my attention, probably our viewers too, when you said that it costs more than a college education. Flesh that out a bit more.
An infant care is between $10,000 and $12,000 a year, so more than tuition than ODU and Norfolk State in our community. So that piece is expensive. It sometimes isn't recognized because a lot of times it's paid on a weekly basis. And so a piece of what the council is looking at is that access component and how impact on low-income families. A lot of low-income families receive what they get for early care and education through subsidies, through departments of social services. So when they're trying to work, to be able to support that. Because if you're making minimum wage work, you can't afford to put your child into child care, and yet you're expected to go to work. So being able to afford that component is really it's a real struggle for families. Usually families with young children, child care is their second biggest expense over their housing, even more than what their food costs tend to be.
We were talking before we started earlier about the preparing youngsters for the workforce and workforce development, and you brought out a point that was really astounding from your perspective on the workforce issue.
Yeah, for early care and education, it's really a double-edged part of the workforce development. So getting those children the correct start, getting them ready because of the 90% of brain development before age 5, so before they walk into public schools. But then the second component is those families are working. I have been in the field, like I said, for over 30 years, and my families are working families. They're not, I might have an occasional family who puts their child in for some social skills, but that's rare. 98 to 99% of my families, they're in there because both parents are working.
And if you closed, then the workforce would really be hurting even more about skilled workers. Yes,
every once in a while I decide, maybe we have a day that we go without childcare, and what would that do? what would happen? And actually there's a video on YouTube that's A Day Without Childcare that I believe Illinois put out that is quite humorous, but it's the reality of, well, who goes where? Where do the nurses then get to go? Where do the doctors go? Where do the taxi drivers go? Where does anybody who gets to work, bus drivers, and then once they're in work, the secretaries, the other workers, be it men and women, what happens? So.
You know, when I was reading over those recommendations and perhaps reading a little fast, I kept seeing VPI, VPI. And then I had to go back to the beginning, make sure our viewers do too. You can tell them about it, that it's not some institution out in Blacksburg, but it's Virginia Preschool Initiative.
That's right.
And is that then the source, the place where the funds are drawn down? You talked about the $70 million.
It will. They will come through that, and they will play a big part in that. And you know, just a point I was going to add on to what Tony was saying. You know, when we talk about economic development, one of my jobs working with the governor is to not only retain good businesses and good workers, but also to attract new businesses, new manufacturers to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so if you ask a company that's interested in locating in Virginia, what is it that we can do in the Commonwealth to attract you to Virginia, at the top of their list is workforce development. And that means a world-class education system. And so this is very, very important, not only in the best interests of our children and their families, but also for our economy in Virginia. And David, one of the things that, you know, we like to throw statistics around, but you know, as a doctor, one of the things that we say is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we know that if our children aren't reading by the time they're in the 3rd grade, there's a very good chance that they're going to end up in our penitentiary system. So that's not in the best interest of children and their families, obviously, and it's not also in the best interest of the Commonwealth. So this is one of those things you can pay for it now or you can pay for it later. And as I said earlier, there's bipartisan support. The business community is very enthusiastic about this, and again, with the federal grant and great people like Tony working on the council, you know, I think some good things are happening here in the Commonwealth.
You know, with your experience and your profession in healthcare, it's reading and it's also healthcare for these youngsters too.
You know, David, it's not only for the youngsters, but you know, if you look at poverty in this country and especially in the Commonwealth, you know, we want to encourage young parents, sometimes single mothers, you know, that there are other ways, and those other ways are through education, through access to health care, to being able to take care of the children that they have. So it's really a win-win situation, for everyone.
You're involved in the healthcare part as well in your work.
Yes, absolutely. Because, like we had said earlier, you know, the early care and education isn't just a single item. It's not just let's teach them to read. You know, the literacy piece is critically important, but it's also their health. It's also their well-being. It's also their social emotional. If you ask any kindergarten teacher what you want these children coming into their schoolroom to look like, they want them to be socially and emotionally strong and stable. It's not and healthy. You know, that it is those are all parts of it. It's not just the education piece of it, the strict education, the cognitive. It is all those components. And the VPI Plus also includes adding some comprehensive services to what is already in the VPI program. Head Start is another program that gets federal funding for children who are at risk that is pretty comprehensive, and they look at the medical dental, they look at the education component, they look at the social emotional, mental health piece. So they are probably the most comprehensive program out there, but it is expensive, quality cost.
You're on your website, you're the one that's listed #1, I think, and maybe it means it's certainly one of the most critical ones, is modernizing the VPI funding formula so that those most in need get the resources. Is that going to be requiring legislation? Is that something that can be done without legislation? How are you going to modernize it so it really gets to the ones that are most in need?
Right. You know, I think it's going to be a combination, David. obviously, there are a lot of these recommendations. Hopefully we can be done on the executive level and work with the governor. There are others that obviously will come through the legislature, and anything that requires funding will obviously come through the House and the Senate and then go to the governor. But again, and it's not all about money. I mean, obviously, as Tony said, these things do cost money, especially for quality and for access. And so one of the areas that we're looking at is, at least taking or looking at our data and making sure that we're doing things right, and if there are things that we can make adjustments, that we can do that. So governance and data is one of the areas that, as you probably saw, that we're working on with our recommendations. But the answer to your question is kind of probably a combination of a lot of the different avenues, and that's one of the things that we're working on with the governor and his administration, Secretary of Education, to move forward with these recommendations.
Yeah, the second one was listed as better coordinating the governance of all
Yeah.
those programs.
And leveraging those funds, leveraging what does come in, and being able to use, and again, as an agency that has done that frequently, taking my United Way dollars and matching them when I'm looking at, trying to add Head Start children into my program, so that there's what we call blended and braided funding, but, trying to leverage the resources, because, resources are limited, but there are some better ways to, I think, use what we do have.
So with the limited resources, whether they're state taxes, resources, or the grant funds, is there a way of involving the private sector in the funding side too, to help? You would know whether that happens on the local level, and you would know probably statewide whether the businesses that are really bought into the need for these initiatives, are they coming with any resources to help?
Locally, they have. In our area, we had a Smart Beginnings coalition, and some of the local businesses were supporting some of the quality initiatives that were going on, and would individually. I can't speak to. I think that's happening in some of the other, where there are Smart Beginnings coalitions around the state, and they have come to the table and said, yes, we get it. We get it. When we moved our facility, we were on a military compound out in Suffolk. We were on the Joint Task Compound, and when we moved off the compound and moved out into the area in North Suffolk, and we talked to the developer, he was like, yeah, I'm not so sure. And then he talked to a business who said, what? You're thinking about putting childcare somewhere nearby where I'm going to locate a business? Okay. So it's that kind of connections that sometimes businesses haven't quite made yet that I think helps in again, the workforce development piece. You put businesses, your workforce, 60% of working families in the workforce have children in childcare. So that's a pretty big number.
60%?
60% of working families have, children under 5 in the workforce. So it's more than that, because you've got school-age children, but that's 60% of the children in the workforce have children under 5. That's
And your council is looking at childhood up through age 8, I believe.
Yes.
Where you're looking at the success, not just what ends by the time they're going to school, but on up age 8, that's maybe through the second grade.
Third grade.
Third grade. Yes.
Yeah, another area, David, and just to come full circle here, is home visits. And so there's certainly families that are at risk, that we know they're there. And we have found that really the return on investment to go into these homes and help. And a lot of times it may be a single parent, but to make sure that their children, have what they need to be prepared for school, that mothers have what they need to remain healthy, to take, good quality care of their children. So as we move forward, we're going to try to expand our home visiting program as well.
another piece of the council's recommendations is that elementary add too, so that that first through third grade, because that's also still critical time. So you had mentioned that it goes up to age 8, and there is a work task force that is looking at the elementary education and how any gains that children make in a VPI, a Head Start, private pre-K, as they move into the public school system, how do we maintain those gains?
The $70 million grant, is that spread over several years, you say?
It is, David, and it's actually $17.5 million per year. over what will hopefully be 4 years. Hopefully, if my math is correct, it's close to $70,000, $70 million, excuse me. And again, that will serve a certain number of additional children in the Commonwealth. So it doesn't, include everybody, but there are certain areas, again, going back to what you were saying earlier, there are pockets in Virginia that we know are at high risk, and we're certainly reaching out to those areas.
So that while it sounds like a big figure, that's relatively small in a way. If that were the only money, it would be kind of small to try to meet all those needs.
It would be, but as we say, every little bit helps.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Now, it seems like I noticed as I, again, looked through the 16 list, on the health part, you did have something about tobacco
Yes.
and about tobacco taxes.
Yes.
Is there a recommendation coming there?
Well, as you know my history
Yes,
here
I do.
in Richmond, David, and as a pediatrician, I don't have a whole lot of good things to say about cigarette use and tobacco use, and we know that there's so many ill effects from that, especially for our children with diseases, asthma and otitis media, even sudden infant death syndrome. So we just, we want to look at ways to increase our revenue, and certainly a cigarette tax is on the table. Taxes in the Commonwealth of Virginia is not a popular word, as you know, but again, those that make that choice, we may ask them to help a little bit out with our revenue.
Well, we're having the conversation here just before you're having a meeting in August. Is there another meeting scheduled before the session? And if so, we want to really encourage people to pay attention to that, because the public's always welcome.
They're absolutely always welcome, and at each meeting we have time set into our schedule for public comment, so we always encourage us. This is a team effort, and I mentioned the council earlier. We've got great individuals with diverse backgrounds, and so we'll discuss some things today. The work groups will continue, and then the next meeting will probably be in December.
Okay.
The information that not only are the recommendations posted, but each of the work groups and the documents that they use to make the decisions and to review were also posted. So there's a lot of really good information posted on the website that is very useful to look at to see where did this recommendation come from, what was the thinking behind it.
So if our viewers don't really get to it immediately from the link we would have up on the screen, if they do as I did, if they Google the Commonwealth Council on Childhood Success, they will see a page or more of links that they can go to and get information, like you say, from the work groups and about what they're doing and what they'll still be doing on up to December. And even though you've submitted a report to the governor, the work goes on.
It continues. And one of the things that we have tried to do, David, is bring in bipartisan representation, so that despite who's in administration is in office, this work will continue, because it's not going to stop in 2 years.
The last one of the top three that you had mentioned, and it's been spoken to somewhat, but let me read it for our viewers and get your comments on it. It has ensuring the health of the youngest and most vulnerable children by early interventions and services.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of early interventions and services would you be looking at?
Well, just a couple things, and I mentioned these a little bit earlier, but first of all, is the child healthy? And do they have access to a primary care provider? Do they have access to their immunizations? Those are all important things. And then the nutrition piece is a big part of our efforts, and as I said earlier, the First Lady, Dorothy McAuliffe, has put a lot of effort into this. But just like if we go to work hungry, we're not going to be productive. Our children fall into the same boat. They need to have good nutrition. They need to be feeling well when they start school in the morning, and so that's what we're working toward.
And some of the other components of an early intervention would be when children have a special need. I'm a grandma, I'm a nana, and I have one of my grandsons is autistic. And so getting him services early has made such a difference than waiting until he's 4 or 5 years old and entering public school. He started getting services when he was 2. So that, working with speech pathologists and occupational therapists and those kinds of things.
Thank you both for being on This Week in Richmond, and look forward to having you back with another conversation.
We'll come back anytime. Thank you for having us, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources, a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward.
Haley Buick GMC in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.